we have Secretary Gordon England, former Deputy Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Navy. Secretary Gordon England served as the 29th Deputy Secretary of Defense from January 2006 to February 2009. He previously served as the 72nd and 73rd Secretary of the Navy and as the first Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to joining the administration of President George W. Bush, Mr. England served as President of the General Dynamics Fort Worth Aircraft Company, later Lockheed, President of the General Dynamics Land Systems Company, and as Corporate Executive Vice President of General Dynamics Information Systems and Technology Sector, Ground Combat Systems Sector, and International Sector. Mr. England is currently active with several companies and with numerous nonprofit organizations, including being a member of and chair of the National Academy of Engineering. Mr. England has served in a variety of civic, charitable, and government organizations, including serving as a city councilman, vice chair, National Board of Goodwill, International, the USO's Board of Governors, the Defense Science Board, the Board of Visitors at Texas Christian University, and many others. He's been recognized for numerous professional and service contributions by multiple university organizations. Without further ado, Secretary Gordon England.
Well, good morning. It is terrific to be here, and thank you for the invitation to join you this morning. First I need to tell you, I've never had a leadership class, and I've never been to a leadership seminar, and I've also never given a very long talk. I have given literally hundreds of talks, and I've never, ever once had someone say to me, your talk was too short. So this is going to be maybe an hour, less. I hope there's time for questions. I mean, I'll try to leave some time so you can ask some questions at the end, because I typically don't want to speak that long anyway, and I have about 45 minutes. Now, last night, I was at the Forrestal lecture. Anyone here at the Forrestal lecture last night? Okay, oh, good, a few people. Okay, terrific. So I thoroughly enjoyed hearing Michael Bloomberg and talk about his leadership principles as he grew up. And by the way, Michael Bloomberg and I have, I think, a lot in common in terms of how we grew up. He said he was a middle-class family. I'm not sure mine was middle class. Neither of my parents made it past the 8th grade. After 8th grade, they both went to work. That's just the way it was at that time. Everybody worked hard after 8th grade. But one thing we had in common is, and it was interesting to hear Michael Bloomberg say it last night, my family was like his. Every single night, our family had dinner together. I have an older brother and sister. The 5 of us had dinner every single night. I mean, that was just the way the family was. And Sunday was special. That was a very special day. We had a special dinner. I still remember back then it was spectacular to have fried chicken. I mean, that chicken was rare. You had that on Sunday. That was a really big treat. But it was a treat to have family together and family conversation. And I think that was important for me, as it was for Michael, to have that as a very, very young person. Now, he did mention a number of attributes of leadership. I took a few notes before I actually get to my remarks for today. I want to comment a little bit and maybe expand on something that he said. So one thing he said last night was, don't take yourself too seriously. I heard that again this morning. So let me expand just a little bit. I was introduced as Secretary of the Navy. Actually, I'm not the Secretary of the Navy, right? I was the Secretary of the Navy, but even that is not exactly right. It turns out you're not the Secretary of the Navy. You hold the office of the Secretary of the Navy. So don't internalize your position. It turns out people are not more important than other people are. Some positions are more important than other positions, but people are not more important. And it's important, I think, to differentiate between yourself and the position you hold. All the authority, all the responsibility, all the accolades, they all go with the office, and they stay with the office when you leave. You actually don't bring your title with you. It stays with the office. I was told that in Australia, you can't take your title with you. That is, once you leave, no one ever refers to you by your title again. I think that's a terrific idea. I think part of the problem we have, particularly in politics, is that people tend to internalize that it's them. It's all about them, and it's not about them. They're only serving for a very short time in an office. And by the way, I think that's characteristic of the military. You don't salute the person, right? You salute the rank. But I think it's important, subtle difference. It's not about you. You merely exercise the authority and responsibility of the office. Okay, he mentioned diversity. And typically when we think about diversity, and what Michael Bloomberg talked about last night, at least as I understood it, was gender and ethnic diversity, which we all think about. But I think there's another kind of diversity, which is hugely important, particularly if you're in a leadership position and you're going to run an organization. That is, in an organization, you need a diversity of views. You need a diversity of people who see things differently, who attack problems differently. People who, quote, you might think of are misfits. And I will tell you, my organization's always attracted all the misfits from all the other organizations because I respected people with different views. I encourage those people, frankly, to come work for me because a lot of times those people were the most creative people. They had the best ideas and the best way to solve problems. So you need to have an open tent when it comes to diversity. We tend to accept people with different ethnic backgrounds, genders, et cetera, but we tend not to accept people who don't think the way we do or the way the organization historically thinks. So you have to be able to accept people with completely different viewpoints, and in fact, people that may irritate you a lot of times. It's okay. Let them hear that you will find out they will be very, very valuable. Now, one thing Michael Bloomberg did not talk about last night, and I just want to mention briefly, and that is, what is it that leaders do? People talk about the attributes of leaders, but what is it that leaders actually do? What do you do every day? So one day my son was in high school, one day years ago. He was a junior in high school and he was thinking about his career. And I was an engineer, working engineer. And he said to me, Dad, he said, what do engineers do? He said, but don't give me a long dissertation. I said, okay. I said, engineers solve problems. He said, wow, that was good. He said, I then assume that the very best problem solvers, they become the boss and they run the organization. And I said, no. I said, the people who solve the problems the best generally end up in about the middle of the organization, which leads to the obvious question. Then who gets to the top of the organization? The people who get to the top of the organization are not the people who solve problems the best. It's the people who know what problems to solve. So when you go into a position, and by the way, when I went in as Deputy Secretary of Defense, ahead of time, Secretary Rumsfeld and I agreed. We worked out an agreement. We took all the functions in the Department of Defense and we put them in, quote, 3 buckets. I had one bucket, he had one bucket, and we had another bucket that we did together, but each one of us was responsible for each thing in the bucket, but we had to do them together. But when I walked into the office of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz was leaving, and he said to me, he said, Gordon, here's the list of 6 or 8 things I'm currently working on. And with that, he walked out of the office. So here I am, Deputy Secretary of Defense. So what do? I mean, there's no job description per se. You now inherit an office, in this case, probably the most complex management position in the country, maybe in the world, because you're managing the largest organization probably in the entire world. And you have to move that organization forward. So you decide, what is it that you do? Now, I think that, by the way, I decided, how is it that you control an organization as big as the Department of Defense? I decided the way you do it is through the budget, money, right? Because that decides what every single function is in the Department of Defense. That sets every priority, and that's how largely I decided to manage the Department of Defense. But so what does a leader do? I have 3 things that the leader does. First of all, the leader decides what's important and what needs to be done. What do you want the organization to accomplish? What are the priorities, and how do you go about that? The leader also creates an environment so that every single person in the organization can excel. So you want every single person to excel, and you create an environment so every person can excel. And the other thing a leader does is they manage the enterprise around them. So if you think about today, think of Google the last couple of days. If you're managing Google, you're not just managing Google, the company sitting, out in California, Silicon Valley. I mean, they're being fined $57 million, right, by the EU. So if you're managing an enterprise that's at large, you have to manage the entire environment around that enterprise. So if you're Deputy Secretary of Defense, you're managing an enterprise, or you're understanding the environment around you, what's going on politically around you, what's going on technically around you, what's going on in terms of threats, what's going on in the Congress, what's going on politically. So I think leaders have antenna. They're always sensing the outside world of every single thing out there to sense what is going on that could affect their enterprise or that they need to know about to move the enterprise forward. So leaders are constantly sensing the environment. They're constantly creating an environment for people to excel, and they're making sure that organizations are doing what is most important. And the last thing I want to say is that from Michael's talk last night, he talked about being in an open office for his team. When I became Vice President of Engineering at General Dynamics in Michigan, that company built ground combat tanks, and it was an offshoot, literally, of World War II when auto companies started building military equipment. So Chrysler Corporation was building M1 tank for the U.S. Army. This was in the 1980s, and it was classic U.S. companies, that is, very, very hierarchical. Leadership was not directly connected with the people. In fact, the leadership of that organization under Chrysler, the plant was north of Detroit. The leadership was actually in an office in downtown Detroit. They weren't even at the facility where they were building the equipment. When I went there, transferred as Vice President of Engineering, walked into the new office I had, and there were a row of offices, and they were inside another office. So if you were an engineer and you wanted to come speak to me, you had to go through 2 closed doors to get into the room where my office was. So there was a message there: don't come in. I mean, if you have to go through 2 closed doors, very few people are ever going to come sit in your office. They were building a new office. They wanted to know how they wanted my office laid out because they had, quote, an executive row. And like Michael Bloomberg, I said, no. The engineers were on the second floor of the new building. I said, I want a glass office. I had to have walls because there's private things you do in organizations, but I had shades on it, but I had it literally, in the middle of the engineering department, I had 4 glass walls so people could see me every day, so they would feel welcome to walk in. And by the way, the door was always open. It always has been. And even when I was Secretary of the Navy and Deputy Secretary of Defense, doors were always open so people could come in. So I think what Michael Bloomberg said last night, you do have to be seen. You do have to be literally with the people. Now, here at the Academy, there's a center, and my good friend, General Statler, and now General Whistler, is running that center. It's the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. The name of that center is everything you need to know, in my view, about leadership. I did not know Admiral Stockdale, but I was invited by his wife to speak at his memorial service in California when he died back in, I think, 2005. So it was a great honor and privilege to speak at his memorial service. At that time, I met his wife for the very first time and also met his sons. And I spent some time with his son, Taylor. And Taylor related to me the story. Taylor was about 10 or 11 years old, 10 years old, I believe, when his father came home as a prisoner in the Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam. And his father had been a prisoner for almost 8 years. So Taylor did not know his father, and his father did not know Taylor. So Taylor said when his father came home, Admiral Stockdale said to Taylor, he said, we do not know each other. He said, so this weekend, next weekend, he said, you decide what you would like to do, and I will do it with you, and we'll spend the weekend together, and we'll get to know each other. So Taylor said, I said, Dad, let's go camping. So here we are after 8 years, prisoner of war. They went camping the next weekend, slept on the ground, cooked hot dogs, etc. So I tell you this story. It's a great human interest story, but I tell you this story because I think it reveals the attribute that, in my judgment, is the single most important attribute of every leader I've ever known that I respected. And I think it is fundamental to me in terms of my personality and how I run organizations. And that attribute, and I do not believe any leader can be successful without this fundamental attribute, and that is leaders care. Leaders care. So Admiral Stockdale, he came home, he cared about his son right away. He cared about his fellow prisoners. He cared about the service. He cared about the country. Leaders are fundamentally caring people. And by the way, I decided a long time ago, I just talked General Whistler and General Statler, Marine Corps generals. The macho Marine Corps, right? I mean, literally finest, I tell people, finest fighting force in the world, and one of the top leadership organizations in the world. But here's his organization, known as a fighting force with all the history, et cetera. In my judgment, the core attribute, the success of the U.S. Marine Corps is because it is a caring organization. Leadership is true in all services. They care about their people, right? People care about each other, and they literally indoctrinate, teach everyone in the organization care. And by the way, I know, in many principles of leadership in the military, the one thing you do is you know your people and you look out for their welfare. But I believe caring is actually more than that. I think if you're going to be a successful leader, you care about your people, you care about the organization, you care about your community, you care about your country, you care about your neighbors, you care about everything. I think a caring person is far more successful than other people when it comes to leadership. I'll give you an example. When I was the president of General Dynamics in Fort Worth, peace dividend occurred 1990s, started. The wall came down in 89. I was president of the company. We were building 18, 20 airplanes a month for U.S. Air Force and also for international customers. When the wall came down, there was a peace dividend. The peace dividend came out of the Department of Defense. So our production rate got cut. And it got cut literally from about 18, 20 a month to 1 a month and maybe part of a international sales, so maybe 1.5 airplanes a month, something like that. But it turns out it took 4 years to build an airplane. 3 years we got it down to, about 3 years to build an airplane. So we knew when the production rate was cut, we knew exactly how that would ripple through production for every single employee. It was all union people in the production line. We knew as the rate went down how we had to terminate employees on the production line. So I decided, because I cared about the people and their families, that we would tell them 2 years in advance when they were going to lose their job. Because we knew to the day when we had to let people off the line. But it wasn't just that we had to cut people off. We also had to reduce costs significantly, because I knew as we got to low rates, we couldn't let the cost of the airplanes go up, because otherwise we couldn't sell international, and we need international to bridge to the next airplane. So at every station of production, we also had a curve saying, here's how you need to reduce costs so that we still have a viable company. So think about this now. 2 years in advance, we told people you're going to be laid off at this date, and in the meantime, we want you to be more efficient and more effective in terms of what you do, because it's important to the company, it's important for our survival. So our HR people said, boss, you do that, we'll never get the airplanes out the door. Everybody will slow down, save their jobs, we'll never get deliveries out. Everybody was against doing this. I persisted, and we did it. So what do you think happened? We ended up with the best airplanes we ever built were during that period of time. Costs came down. When people would leave, they would come see me. I still remember a person walking in my office. He said, Mr. England, 2 years ago, my wife and I were going to buy a new car, but instead of buying a new car, knowing I was going to be terminated, she went and took nursing classes. And he said, we're going to be okay now. So I found out that what happens is that when you care about people, they care about you. I was walking on the production line one time about this time and talking to people on the production line, and one of the fellows said to me, he said, Mr. England, he said, have a good trip next week. And I walked away, I thought, wow, I travel a lot, but how do people in the production line know about my trips? So I went back and I said, I'm just curious, how do you know I'm traveling next week? Still gives me goosebumps to tell you this. He said, well, Mr. England, he said, every time you travel, he said, your secretary lets us know. He said, because we have a prayer group. He said, at lunchtime, the last 10 minutes of lunch, he said, our prayer group gets together. And whenever you travel, we pray for your safe return. Gives me goosebumps to this day, right, to think that people praying for my safe return. But when you care for people, people care for you, and they care for what you represent. So I don't think you can get away from this caring. I mean, this is so fundamental to leadership. If you're going to be successful, people will care about you, and they will take on the attributes because they respect you and that you care for them. So the other part of caring, the other part is ethical leadership. Everything I ever need to know about ethical leadership, I learned when I was a very young boy. And those childhood lessons have stayed with me and guided me for my entire career. My brother is about a year older than me, and we both served newspapers in Baltimore. But about the time we were serving newspapers, they came out with a paper every week, and I'm not sure what was in the paper, except they had coupons. Now, coupons were a brand new thing. That is, you could get a coupon and save a nickel or a dime or something. And the newspaper would have 10 or 15 coupons embedded in the paper. So my brother and I would also deliver this paper every week. And one week, the local grocer, so at that time in the city, you know, there were little stores, neighborhood stores on the first floor at the street level, and the grocer lived above it. And so right down the street from our house, the grocery store, and Paul was the fellow's name who ran the grocery store. So Paul said to us fellas, he said, listen, he said, if you have any of those papers left over, he said, bring me the coupons and I'll give you $1 for them. I'll tell you, this was like manna from heaven to get $1 and not have to do anything except get your old coupons and give them to Paul down the street, right? So we gathered up the coupons, took them to Paul. Paul gave us $1. My brother and I were pretty excited about this. That night, my dad came home from work. We said, you know, Dad, we just made $1. So my dad took my brother and I down to Paul's, and he told Paul that he didn't like Paul corrupting his sons. He wanted the coupons back, and we gave Paul the $1 back. And my dad explained to us that what Paul was doing, he didn't have to sell anything. He was just getting the coupons, turn them in. He would get the money, didn't have to sell anything, right? It definitely was not the proper thing to do. It was definitely unethical. Probably wasn't illegal, definitely unethical. So my dad told us why this was not the right thing to do and why we had to give the $1 back and why, you know, we had to get the coupons back and just destroy them. I also have a sister. So my brother, sister, and I, when we were small, we had no long list of rules. That is, we had to be home for dinner a certain time. But we basically were on our own. We could do anything we wanted. My mother and father did not have a long list of rules for us. We could do anything we wanted, but there was one caveat. The one caveat is that we could never do anything. We could never do anything that would embarrass my mother. Now you think about this. I mean, my entire life, this has guided my behavior. Secretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Navy, President of companies. Whenever I got into a situation that really I had to think about, I would think to myself, is this going to embarrass my mother? It turns out ethically, you cannot put lists on the walls of things you can do and what you can't do because every situation changes. You actually do have a moral compass, and my sweet mom and dad understood that. we do have a moral compass. And the moral compass that's always guided me was just that: never embarrass your mother. General Sattler reminded me, I was in the Pentagon one time, and we were hosting high school students who were exceptional students. And so they were making the rounds of Washington, D.C., and I was asked to speak to the students. And I made some remarks, and after remarks, one of the students said to me, he said, "Mr. Secretary," he said, "how do you handle an ethical dilemma?" Pretty good question for high school. I think it was junior in high school. How do you handle an ethical dilemma? Now, in a situation like that, you have to have sort of a quick answer. You can't have a long dissertation, right? And by the way, you want something they're going to remember. So General Satter reminded me today, when the student said, "How do you handle an ethical dilemma?" I said, "It's easy because I never have ethical dilemmas. Because when you have an ethical dilemma, you already know the answer. There is no gray area with an ethical dilemma. So if you're in a gray area, you shouldn't be there. So you don't get into ethical. If you're in an ethical dilemma, you already know what the answer is and behave accordingly." I'd also want to comment, there's one other dimension to ethical leadership. And by the way, there is no other kind of leadership. There is no other kind of leadership except ethical leadership. And by the way, if you are not ethical, people will immediately sense it and know it. So, you have to be ethical in every single thing you do and in every circumstance. People find it sometimes difficult to deal with politicians because politicians, by definition, are vague and indirect almost all the time. My approach has been the polar opposite. If there's anything you want to remember about being ethical, it's being ethical with other people. And the way you are ethical with other people is, and here's sort of my 8 words. I've been guided by never embarrass your mother, and these 8 words in terms of how I deal with other people. That is forthright, honest, direct, with everyone in every circumstance. Guide your life this way: forthright, honest, direct, with everyone in every circumstance. So if you want to know what's God in my life, that's it. I never embarrass my mother, forthright, honest, and direct with everybody in every circumstance. Now, don't worry about the trivia. I'm not so direct that I tell my wife she looks, overweight in a new dress or something, right? There are limits you can put on this, but in matters of substance, of what is important when you're in those situations. So in Washington, D.C., that was my reputation. My reputation on the Hill was forthright, honest, and direct. And one time I testified on a program called Viegas, long forgotten, but at the time it was a hugely large political issue about closing a base called Viegas off of Puerto Rico. I noticed the superintendent's nodding and some other people nodding. And I testified before the House Armed Services Committee. It was my very first testimony as Secretary of the Navy on this issue. And it was a hugely contentious issue, and the hearing was contentious. Literally, people were mad, and the whole thing was very, very difficult to get through. But afterwards, Bob Stump called me into his office. He was chairman at the time, and I'm brand new Secretary of the Navy. But I had decided I was going to handle this meeting like everything else in life. No matter what the questions were, the answer was going to be forthright, honest, and direct. So no matter what the question was, that's what the answer was. That's what came out of me. And Bob Stump said to me, he said, "Gordon," he said, "you've made it." He said, you're going to do well in Washington. He said, that was a very difficult hearing. He said, but you know, he said, there's people in this committee that don't like what you said, but they all respect what you said because what you said was direct and honest. He said, and every person on this committee respects you. So it causes me to make one other comment to you. Leaders are not always liked, but it's not about being liked, it's about being respected. And so I always find it fascinating to look at polls about political leaders and how much they're liked, and I think it's not about being liked, it's about being respected, because a lot of times you have to do things that people don't like, but they do have to respect you. So I think I'm going to, we have about 10 minutes. So I think I'm going to stop. I have a few more comments, but I'm going to stop because I'd like to, if there's people here, students particularly, have questions, I just soon address them as to continue. So I'm going to stop. If there's a question or two, I'll try to address it for you.
Good morning, sir. So how do you be in a position, especially as the Secretary of the Navy, that involves life or death and not have an ethical dilemma? How can questions be ethically black or white?
So I'm going to ask somebody to repeat. I have a little trouble hearing in this large room here. Maybe somebody could help me with the question. John? So again, I don't believe there's gray areas. I mean, look, you examine the facts, you make a decision. I'm not sure how to tell you. I mean, I just don't deal in gray areas. I don't see that there are gray areas. You do the absolute best decision you can make. I do believe there's a responsibility here, though. I mean, if you're in a leadership position, you don't make decisions that affect life and death unless you actually know every single fact you can get within that time period and make the best decision you can make. And again, that's what leaders do. And you make those decisions on the best data available. I will say that in a lot of those positions, and particularly, I think in any senior position, you really have limited amounts of data. You never, ever know the whole circumstance, but to the best of your ability, you make the best decision based on the facts available. I do think, but you do have a responsibility to get the data, which reminds me to say this while you're here. Teams. I think it's really important you get the best team you can. Rumsfeld said grade A people attract grade A people. So it's really important that you get that your key people are top people because they attract other top people. But you also have to go beyond your team. I don't think you can just be surrounded by your team, particularly on major decisions like that. You have to get input outside your team to make sure that biases have not crept in just because they want to keep the boss happy.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, my name is Josiah, and I'm from College of the Ozarks. I'm glad you mentioned surrounding yourself with a good team, because my question is, when it comes to diversity within a workforce, how do you as a leader staff your workforce so they're both diverse, so they have different thoughts, but at the same time they have similar values? So how do you kind of negotiate between having a diverse thought, but then maybe compromising on some of those values that you hold as an organization to be your core?
So I think if I heard that right, how do I get a diverse workforce, but at the same time make sure that they meet the standards in terms of knowledge and everything else you need? And so let me say this. I think this is tough to do, but it's getting better. I mean, for a long time, we did not have good educational opportunities for women. We did not have good educational opportunities for minorities. Still don't, unfortunately, for a lot of minorities. but we are now getting highly qualified people across the whole spectrum of American society. And so I think that's not as big an issue as it was in the past. It was an issue in the past, but we went to great pains to try to find qualified people. Last night, Michael Bloomberg, he talked about having scholarships specifically so people, diverse people, people who did not have the wherewithal to be able to afford their way to go to Johns Hopkins could participate. So I think there's less of an issue now in terms of getting a diverse workforce, and there's a lot of effort literally to reach out and find qualified people of various ethnic and various women backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds that you can select from. But I'll tell you, it's still important to get a diverse viewpoint. I mean, part of diversity, right, is to get a range of inputs. But if you get a range of inputs and you don't allow people with literally coming from different perspectives, right, quote, the misfits in an organization, you have to have that as part of your diversity.
Thank you very much.
Sir Midshipman Second Class Lawrence from the United States Naval Academy. Could you talk about a time where you're saying "don't embarrass your mother" was challenged the most, and how you worked through that moment?
Oh yeah, well, so interesting. Don't embarrass your mother. I mean, we were young children, 8, 6, 7, 8, 10 years old, that sort of time. Is that what you mean? How old was I? Oh, an example of don't embarrass your mother.
When that saying was challenged the most in your career, sir?
When it was challenged most in your career, sir.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand this.
So it was like an example of don't embarrass your mother, but possibly
Oh. Okay. Do I really want to talk about this? No, look, I think anytime, particularly when you're dealing with people, you're dealing with organizations, that's really when the dilemmas come up. Do people in the workforce, are you going to dismiss somebody, or how you're going to deal with something with the press, or do you include comments maybe that you heard in a discussion? Particularly if you're writing articles, books. By the way, I disagree with people who write books who have inside knowledge of organizations. I think that's frankly unethical. So I think situations like that, particularly when people would ask my views on subjects, is this something I want to talk about, particularly in personnel matters and things of that sort. Everything I do, no matter what comes up, I sort of put it to that test. So I don't think there's these profound decisions that I have to put that to. I think that's an everyday thing. And by the way, if you do it every day, there are no profound ones you have to worry about, I'm happy to say.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. My name is Aiden Riley, and I'm a second class or a junior here at the United States Naval Academy. My question is about change and focus within an organization. Recently, in his resignation letter, Secretary Mattis wrote to the president. He said, "You have the right to have a Secretary of Defense whose views better align with yours." And I frame this in the most apolitical sense possible. So I ask you, sir, my question is, how does an organization or a company or a department like the Secretary had to do, or a platoon in such a sense, maintain mission integrity and maintain organization when there's a hierarchical disagreement or disagreement at the highest level? Thank you.
So, it turns out the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief. Secretary of Defense works for the Commander-in-Chief. And by the way, I talked to General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, Christmas Eve. I called and we chatted and sent emails back and forth because I know General well, Secretary well. Without that specific case, let me talk about that specific case. Secretary does work for the President of the United States, and by the way, we are committed to follow out the policies of the Commander-in-Chief. I mean, that's what you do as Secretary, and if the Secretary is at odds with that, I think he did the right thing. I mean, if you're at odds with the person you work for, I think he did the right and appropriate thing to lead, because he wasn't comfortable carrying out orders that conflicted with his personal beliefs. I do think there is a chain of command, and you do have to follow that chain of command. And that was the case with me when I was a deputy. You know, I followed what was important to the secretary, and I think he followed what was important to the president. I think if you get into a dilemma like General Mattis did, then you do have to follow your conscience. I mean, this is a case where it's an ethical decision on his part. Does he follow what he firmly believes, or you know, does he leave the organization? I think he made the appropriate decision myself.
Thank you, sir.
We have time for one more question.
So let me make one comment. Maybe I hate to stop the question. I do want to give you one input though. I think I do not think you can manage unless you understand the environment you're in. And I do think the world is changing very, very rapidly. Technology is roaring through society, and it will have huge, huge implications. It already is. If you think about it, for the first time ever, we are naming generations, right? So we are naming generations because each generation is different than the generation before it. And it's all because of technology that's roaring through society. And while a lot of changes have happened in my lifetime, right now the changes are vastly more rapid, they're more pervasive, and they're actually happen internationally. So I think my last advice to you is, you are going to have to stay very attuned to what is going on in this environment around you, particularly as technology changes both the civilian and the military situation. I said earlier, leaders have to have their antenna out. There is going to be a lot of turmoil, in my judgment. There's already turmoil in this country, and I think a lot of it is technology-based. AI, some pundits are saying that AI is more profound than electricity on society. I mean, if that's the case, and by the way, The Economist yesterday said that AI will have huge implications for society. So with these changes coming, I think it's going to be very, very hard for leadership to grasp these changes and understand them and be able to adapt. So one recommendation for everyone here is, don't overly specialize. And if you overly specialize, make sure that you have a much broader understanding outside. I mean, everything, political, economic, financial, technical, all of this is going to have dramatic changes in the years ahead. I think it's going to be vastly more difficult to manage in the future, to be a leader in the future than it has been in the past, because of the rapid change that's taken place. And again, when we name generations, that's pretty profound when you think about it. So you're going to have to be a leader of all these different strata of generations we have just here in America, much less what's happened around the world. So it's going to be a difficult time to be a leader going forward. You're going to have to work at it, and you're going to have broad knowledge if you're going to be effective in the future. Last question.
Sir, Officer Cadet Paul from Britannia Royal Naval College in the UK. Just briefly, you spoke about not internalizing your position. I'm sure you've worked with people that do that. How do you bring them round to your viewpoint of not internalizing their position?
So I've always been pretty direct with people in my organization that internalize their position. I mean, I just don't let people internalize positions, right? And people who do are not effective. I mean, if you work for a person who has internalized that position and quote, they're just very proud of what their position is. I mean, if they internalize it, typically it's not a person you want to work for. And there have been cases where I work for people who internalize their positions and I didn't work for them. I mean, I just wouldn't do it, right? Because they weren't effective leaders. So that's all I can say is if you have somebody like that, I mean, you wait it out or right.
Understood. Thank you, sir.
I was in the civilian sector. I had it easier to do. I could always just change my position, right? You know, move somewhere else or do something else.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, time's up. I thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today.
Sir, on behalf of the Naval Academy, we'd like to present you this gift, and thank you for coming here today and giving our keynote.
Was that my jacket or what is that?
It's just a